Chapter 13. Not the smoothest thing Ken had ever said, but there wasn't any good way to approach the subject of shifting. Tearing it off like a band, it had seemed like a good idea at the time, except now there was murder in Betty's glare. He held up his hands in surrender to ward off a pending attack. He didn't want to hurt her. It was the last thing he wanted. Ken had it his way. They would tell the packs to fuck off and live their lives as they wanted. But where? Werewolves lived everywhere, even in some places that humans refused to permanently settle, like the Antarctic. The threat on Betty's life would be present no matter what they did, unless she either shifted or he left her. The latter would not happen. Not unless he had no other choice. What he had to explain to Betty would most likely end up with him missing some teeth, though. I warned you. This is part of the discussion that you're not going to like. The part where you wanted witnesses so I don't kill you. You really can't kill me. He was a beta for a reason. He'd been studying martial arts since the day Ryota had signed his adoption papers, but he needed to make that clear to his mate before she tried. She narrowed her eyes. If I'm your soulmate, then you'll never lay a hand on me. She had him there. Damn, she was good. That's supposed to go both ways, where you can't hurt me either. The way she fisted her hands didn't have him convinced, though. Speak now. Fast. She spat out the words as if they tasted bad. He guided her to the chairs she had set out in the waiting room, and they sat facing each other. I made a huge mistake. He hung his head and closed his eyes. I told the pack you're my soulmate without thinking of the consequences. Would she understand the error of his ways? Oh, Ken. She covered her mouth with her hands. I was so excited. He lifted his gaze to hers. I've been searching for you. For years. Here you were, right under my nose the whole time. My pack knew about my quest. Some even dared to make fun of me, so when I found you I told the biggest gossip in the pack. Betty slowly shook her head. I bet everyone thinks I can shift because I'm your soulmate. She slid her hands over her cheeks, her eyes wide with fear. I can't fake this. What will your alpha do if he finds out? Ken sank deeper in his chair. She sat up straighter. Oh my God, he already knows? Your old pack's alpha had asked Ryota to keep an eye on you. My father has been keeping quiet tabs. Which alpha? The old one or new one? Does it matter? She jumped up and paced the room. Yes, it does. If it's the old alpha, then no problem. But if the new one? The young one who won the challenge at 18? Same year I was banished at 18. She looked at him as if expecting some reaction, but his mind was a blank. We were an item in high school, she continued with exasperation. We dated. A lot. The present alpha of Riverbend Pack is your ex-boyfriend? He growled at the thought of anyone else touching her. That her ex was an alpha made Ken grind his teeth. Did you love him? It was the only thing he couldn't bear. Her loving another man. She rolled her eyes to the ceiling. He was a thing. A rebellion against the pack. I was the one girl he shouldn't date, so I pursued him. Few months later I was banished as a human. My parents told me that he petitioned to have me returned. When our old alpha denied him, Chris lost his shit and attacked. That's how he inherited the pack. And he's been keeping tabs on you. Ken liked this less and less. Has he ever tried to contact you? No. It was never a serious thing. He defeated an alpha over you. I think that's pretty serious. Ken had been having similar thoughts. He would fight everyone to keep Betty. Apparently Betty had that kind of effect on men. Chris is kind of intense. Most alphas are. He massaged his temples. So what did your father say when you told him your soulmate was a half-breed who couldn't shift? She sat next to him and rested her head on his shoulder. She seemed so tiny and delicate next to him, yet so fierce and beautiful in spirit his heart wanted to burst. He rested his arm over her shoulder. He'd like you to give shifting another try with new teachers. He kissed her forehead as he twisted Ryota's threats into something sweeter. You're my soulmate and only shifters can trigger that response. There's more werewolf in you than you think. She met his stare, something most shifters couldn't do. I know there's more. I always have, but nothing I try works. Don't get me wrong, I would do anything to shift. She almost growled out that last part. I'm not sure my heart can take it. Being cast out almost killed me the first time. If we do this and fail, I might not survive. He squeezed her against him, her scent filling his nose and her words a dagger in his chest. Betty buried her nose against Ken's exposed neck. His scent was a drug in her system. Was this the soulmate smell he kept referring to? She traced the tip of her tongue along his throat. He tasted nice like earth and salt. His arms tensed around her. His protective instincts toward her were a reminder of what she'd lost with her pack. She missed this, knowing someone had her back 24/7. There was no pushing away or not now. In the short time they'd known each other, he hadn't said no to any of her demands, though he had negotiated quite a lot. Those skills probably made him a great financial officer. She crawled onto his lap, arms caging him in. I smelled this scent last night, too. Moving her nose to the other side of his throat, she inhaled deeper. Spicier than cinnamon with a hint of citrus and sunshine spread through her, burning away the dark shadows of her past. She closed her eyes, her aching heart drumming in her chest. It's true. The soulmate scent is true. How is that possible? What do you smell? Hope. She didn't want to move, afraid she'd lose this moment. Proof that she truly was shifter like she had always believed. All those times her father had told her to just believe and trust in her instincts. She'd thought they were lies after the crushing truth of not shifting. It made no sense. She fisted Ken's t-shirt in her hands. What the fuck? We'll figure it out. What matters is that you believe me now. He lifted her face so their gazes clashed, his scent still fresh in her nose with sunlight pouring through the window behind him. A halo framed his golden head and his amber eyes glowed with an inner light as their souls connected. His lips parted. Betty. With one sharp tug she pulled his t-shirt over his head and tossed it across the floor. His intense gaze narrowed with a predator's focus. A feral growl rolled in his chest. Oh dear, what had she unleashed? She gasped as he tackled her, one hand cradling her head so it wouldn't knock on the floor. Hard muscles slid under sun-kissed skin. She'd seen Ken in all his glorious nakedness, but having it pressed against her between her thighs, she suddenly realized how much power his body held. Gathering the hem of her shirt, he dragged it slowly along her torso while trailing his nose along her abdomen. He groaned as he reached her bra and paused to lick over the lace. His gaze darted to hers as if assessing her reaction, all predatory and feral. Her nipples perked at his attention. He twirled the tip of his tongue around her hard bud, so moist and hot. She dug her nails into his shoulders, arching her back. His teeth grazed over the material just before he nipped the sensitive area. She cried out, pain and pleasure playing off each other. Sensing her need, he pressed his mouth to Betty's, taking her in a deep, sweet kiss. She loved it. He tasted like heat and spice and all the things missing in her life. Things she'd been craving with each passing hour. She moaned into his mouth as he caressed her face, touching her cheeks, her forehead, the shells of her ears with delicate brushes of his fingertips. She couldn't think about evictions or pack or anything else other than the feel of this beautiful and powerful wolf shifter claiming her. The banished, the half-breed. Betty, he growled as his tongue stroked against hers. She shuddered and ran her hands over his broad, muscled shoulders, tracing every detail and committing it to memory. With an expert's ease, he undid the front clasp of her bra. He hovered, his possessive stare sweeping over her exposed breasts, heavy with desire. She shook them so they bounced with enticement. A sharp inhale and he pounced upon them, sucking, caressing, cupping. She tangled her fingers in his short silken hair, her mind filled with the white noise of sensation. All air seemed to vanish and she couldn't catch her breath. Feral noises filled the room. Ken tugged at the fastenings of her jeans, fingers desperate and rough as he undressed her, flinging her clothes like parade ribbons over the furniture. She loved it. He knelt between her legs and spread them wider, his gaze scorching. His big hands smoothed down her inner thighs, slow and firm. Betty sucked in a breath, muscles shivering in anticipation. Your hands feel good. He shot her a fast, smug grin before lowering his mouth over her lady parts. His hot breath blew over her exposed flesh as he ran his raspy tongue between her folds. Shudders rippled through her, shudders of desire. She loved the feel of his mouth against her, the dangerous power in him. Knowing he could be so gentle with her, his entire focus on giving her pleasure. Ken rumbled and sank against her, his mouth buried between her thighs. She gasped because it made things feel even better, the vibrations moving through. His mouth seemed to transfer directly to her pleasure centers. Her hands went to his head, and despite herself, she clung to his hair. "Oh, have mercy," she cried out breathlessly. She savored every long stroke, every flick, every swirl, every rasp against her most sensitive spots. He increased the intensity of his attentions as if he could magically sense she needed more. Of course he could sense it. They were connected. Soulmates. She came with a rush, crying out his name. Her muscles clenched tight and she shouted again even as he continued to pleasure her, dragging out her climax. The world exploded in a haze where only Ken's mouth existed and she was oblivious to everything else. Slowly she returned to reality, panting. Her body feels like a spring. Uncoiling. She flung her arm over her eyes. Okay, they had just done that. Wow. Ken kissed a line along her inner thigh, his chuckle full of self-assured satisfaction. Pressing her bare foot to his chest, she shoved him back onto his perfect ass. He grunted in surprise. She rolled forward with her momentum and straddled his supine form. The hard bulge in his jeans strained his zipper as she undid the fastening. Payback. This was how soulmates were supposed to act. Passionate, hungry, needing to be together. It all made sense now. A feral grin was his response. "I look forward to it." The waiting room door flung open. Sunlight flooded the room, blinding her for a moment. She squealed and covered her breasts with her hands. What had they been thinking, getting it on here in the public area? That was right. They hadn't been thinking. Instincts had taken over. Ken sat up, arms hugging her tight as he blocked anyone's view of her nakedness with his broad back. She peeked over his shoulders, expecting shocked biddy ladies returning early from their walk. Betty's eyes widened, straining at her intense surprise. Chapter 14. For fuck's sake, Pumpkin, get some clothes on. Dad slammed the door shut. Staying outside with Betty could only assume her mother. Betty could hear muffled voices as she scrambled for her clothes like a child, caught in the middle of playing doctor with the boy next door. She cringed. Not again. She was going to get an earful. No matter what her age, her dad would always treat her as if she were still 5. Ken tucked his t-shirt over her head and it fell mid-thigh. "Your dad." He sounded stunned and looked pale. "Betty Marie Newman, you should know better." Her mother's voice rose on the other side of the door. Betty felt nauseous. Running his fingers through his hair, Ken strode to open the door. He paused. "How do we look?" "Like we just had rough sex." "I wonder why," he hissed. He threw the door open and extended his hand to her. "Father." "Ken Birch, sir. Beta for the Newport pack." Ken transformed into the professional businessman he claimed to be. So far, she'd seen him unconscious in a dog cage, pedaling a boat and deliciously naked. She hadn't experienced this part of him. Dad's face was so red his ears glowed. He eyed Ken's hand as if looking for a poisonous barb before grasping it. She heard knuckles crack but didn't know. "Who's Beta, huh?" Her mom pushed past the men, her arms extended for a hug from Ken. "Soulmates." She tucked him against her ample chest and kissed his cheeks. "Oh, I heard the stories." She winked at Betty. "So don't be so shocked." "Chuck." She rubbed Dad's shoulder with force. Betty didn't know who was praying harder for a hole to open under their feet and swallow them whole, her Ken or her dad. Mom eyed Ken's bare chest before patting Betty's behind. "Nice job, honey," she whispered. "Mom." Her mother tended to forget how good shifters could hear. There was no point to a whisper in a pack. Both men twisted to stare at Mom. She cleared her throat. "Let's go find you some better clothes before your father has a stroke." She grabbed Betty's hand and led her to the stairs. Ken's eyes popped, pleading for her to stay, as they followed her and her mother across the room. Dad still gripped Ken's hand, knuckles white. Before Betty moved upstairs, her mother spun toward the guys. "Be nice, Chuck," she snapped in her drill sergeant voice. Dad dropped Ken's hand. Betty could trust in him to not kill her mate now that Mom had given the command. She might be human, but she'd been dealing with shifters longer than Betty had been alive. Dad wouldn't cross Mom. She wasn't sure anyone would. Betty swore Mom swallowed razor blades to keep her tongue so sharp. Once inside her apartment, she covered her face with her hands. "How did you get here so fast?" "We drove all night." Mom went straight to Betty's fridge. "Stop fretting. Your father's seen you naked before. But not while straddling her boyfriend and playing tug-of-war with his zipper. Oh, that breakfast burrito wanted to come back up. Betty sat onto the sofa and stuck her head between her knees. She couldn't think of a worse way for Ken to meet her parents. Well, she guessed they could have caught him between her legs if they had arrived 2 minutes earlier. Silver lining. Betty. Mom clapped her hand sharply. Clothes on. She jumped to her feet, head spinning, and hurried to her bedroom closet. All the outfits the girls had brought yesterday cluttered every available surface. Space. Ugh. She tossed silk and satin over her shoulders until her fingers touched cotton. She changed into fresh panties and a bra before pulling on a pink sundress. Below her feet in the waiting room, ominous silence thundered. Please don't break my furniture, Dad. An empty pit formed in her belly. She needed them to like each other. They were the two most important men in her life, after all. Her knees weakened and she dropped onto the edge of the bed. She'd known Ken 24 hours and he had made it to the top 3 people in her life. That was a record. This time there really wasn't enough air in the room. Betty gasped, her chest heaving faster and faster, but it felt like nothing moved in her lungs. Her heart raced and her head spun. Your fridge is empty. I'm going. Mom halted at the entrance. She crossed the space between them, pinching Betty's nose shut and folding her in half so she was forced to hold her breath. She struggled and broke her mother's hold, coming up for air in one big gasp. Instead of the guppy breath she'd been taking. You haven't hyperventilated in years. She cradled Betty's face in her hands. Slow and deep, just like we practiced. Soulmates. Yes. She stroked her hair and hugged Betty tight. It's exciting. Human. I know. I've discussed it with both your dad and the alpha. Alpha. She jerked from her mother's grasp. Which alpha? See, you're breathing better already. Mom, answer me. Tell me you didn't say anything to Chris. Her ex-boyfriend. Didn't need to know anything about her new life. He'd been a controlling jerk. With daddy issues. Your father had to say something. We needed permission to come to Newport. The fastest way was through the alphas. So technically we spoke with both. She leaned against her mother, head resting against her bosom. Ken thinks I should be able to shift since we're soulmates. Your dad and the alphas agree. Betty had abandoned Ken to the mercy of her father. A shifter's Ken was more dominant and much stronger, but come on, he wasn't about to knock out his future father-in-law. Can I come in? Chuck asked. He then realized he was still blocking the way into the rescue. He stepped back and let him inside. Can I have my hand back? The guy had a grip. No. Broken bones though. He'd seen Ryota break a man's hand once. The guy had been a jerk. He hooked his thumbs in his belt loops and maintained eye contact. The muscles in his back twitched, ready for a fast shift if Chuck tried anything. He had just caught Ken in the act of fucking his little girl. In his shoes, Ken would be postal. Chuck was built like a linebacker. A touch of gray in his goatee and around his ears. Otherwise he looked strong like an ox. Blue ink lined his arms and neck. Not colorful tats like Betty's. These were old shifter tribal symbols. Nice ones too. I like your ink. His eyebrows shot up and he glanced at his arms. Thanks. Same artist as your daughter's? Nah, she used a New Age vampire to do the work. Ken nodded, not sure what a New Age vampire was. Newport didn't have many bloodsuckers. The pack didn't tolerate many in their territory. Sorry about. He pointed to where Betty and he had been on the floor. I didn't know you. We're coming for a visit. Betty didn't say anything. Chuck shook his head. We've been distracted. Chuck narrowed his eyes. I bet. Not like that. He held up his hands. Peace. He laughed. That was our first time, Anne. On the fucking floor in a public area. Your first? Chuck's face went purple. As his hands fisted. No. Ken ducked, faster than the older shifter, as Betty's father swung. Easy, Chuck. Don't make me hurt you. He tried to keep his voice low so the girls wouldn't hear. Chuck's eyes shifted and claws formed from his fingertips. What if those sweet old ladies returned from walking? Ken couldn't have an out of control shifter in the rescue. He stopped. Chuck's next punch caught his fist in his hand and squeezed. Chuck's eyes widened, jaw dropping open as he sank to his knees. A hand held many nerve endings. Pain was a useful tool to snap a shifter back into the reality of their situation. He held Chuck's fist a few seconds longer until he saw the werewolf part of him fade away. He blinked and diverted his gaze from Ken's in submission. Beta, he spoke in a gravelly voice full of resentment. Ken knelt and offered him his hand. You can call me Ken. Think we can start? Over. The front door behind him opened and the room filled with the sounds of excited barks. We're ready for the next batch, Betty, called out one of the dog walkers. He and Chuck jumped to their feet. Ken gathered leashes from the women, passing some of the dogs to Chuck. She's busy with her mom. I'll gather the next batch. Any specific dogs? The leashes tangled around his legs as his very distant cousins did their best to tie him and Chuck in knots together. Any of them but the Great Danes. Betty walks them herself. He shuffled to the back room dragging the yipping pups. He was glad to see Chuck wasn't doing any better. The yard is fenced. Chuck pointed to the side door leading out of the kennel area. Let's put these mutts out there. We'll sort 'em out after. He followed Chuck's lead. He knew his daughter's home better. Ken's memories of the kennel were still fuzzy. It took 4 hands and a few choice swears for both werewolves to untangle the leashes, collect more dogs, and bring them out to the ladies. How does your daughter manage this by herself? Chuck snorted. You really don't know her well. No, but I mean to. Betty returned. Oh. She halted at the bottom step in a pretty pink sundress. That really shouldn't have made him think such inappropriate thoughts in front of her dad. Thanks, guys. We like what you did to the place, Betty. The view is much improved. The older women stared at him pointedly. Only then did he realize he still didn't have a shirt on. Betty tossed him his t-shirt and waved bye to the walkers. I'm going to help Mom find the coffee. Let's go sort out those dogs, son. Chuck patted his shoulder before heading him to the kennel room. He pulled on his shirt, unable to stop his smile. What a story he'd have to tell his grandkids. Chuck was checking dog tags to the names on the kennels one dog at a time, while Ken made sure water bowls were full. You're sure about being her soulmate? He asked. I wouldn't lie about such a thing. I'm 100% sure. Chuck grunted. You never know what a shifter is willing to do to get into a pretty girl's pants. He closed the dog kennel door. But I see how you look at her. Ken nodded. I'd never do anything to hurt her. I spoke with my alpha before I left Riverbend. If she doesn't learn to shift, the packs will kill my baby girl. I think you did enough harm. Your alpha told you that? Shit, word was spreading too fast. He thought he'd have more time before the other packs found out she couldn't shift. He didn't have to. She can't shift, boy. A human soulmate isn't possible. You should have known better than to blab. He crossed his arms. You came to protect her. Damn straight. What are you going to do? Try to teach her to shift. He shrugged. Or die trying. Chuck gave him a sharp nod as if not expecting less from Ken. You get started. Alphas aren't known for their patience. Chapter 15. Betty came downstairs again with 2 cups of coffee. Mom is going to take a nap, she told her father, then handed Ken one of the drinks. They drove all night. I'll join her then. Chuck stretched, then gave Betty a kiss on the cheek. You spend some time with your mate. He tossed Ken a meaningful glance. Once Chuck was gone up to the apartment, she blew out a relieved breath. I guess hell can freeze over. What do you mean? Ken chuckled. He approves of you. He does. Granted, Ken was still alive, but he hadn't gotten any fuzzy feelings from her dad. None of the furniture is broken. He mustn't have tried hard to kill you. The day is still young. He drank his coffee in a few gulps. Let's go before anyone else distracts us. She set her cup aside. Where to? Her grimace spoke volumes. You want me to try to change shape? No, I want you to do it. There's a huge difference. Ken heard the echo of Ryota in his words. It was how Ken had been taught by his father. She gave him the one-fingered salute. No shit. She stormed outside. He followed her onto the empty sidewalk. The furious gaze she tossed over her shoulder melted his bones. She was so beautiful he could barely breathe. Ken took her by the shoulder so she wouldn't run again. You are a shifter. Accept that fact. We've proved it. Now we just need to figure out what is blocking your attempts to change shape. She shrugged out of his grasp. I've been through block therapy, Ken. 3 years of it. I've done the visualization exercises, emotional trigger, explorations and DNA testing. I can't imagine you knowing something that I haven't tried. I'm your soulmate. You might respond to my call. He had spent a lot of time thinking about teaching her last night while tossing and turning. The anger faded from her face and she drew closer. You have my attention. Good. He wove their fingers together. Let's take a walk. There wasn't a whole lot of information on calling another's wolf form. From what he'd read, it was an emotional tug of war. He had tried something similar with Angie when they first met and had thought she was possibly a wolf shifter. It hadn't worked, but he hadn't been her soulmate either. Where are we going? The park. There's a secluded area that is usually empty. As long as he and Betty remained out of sight where they could change shape in the park. Ryota didn't like public shifting. It frightened the humans and made the authorities tense. He had planned to take her home, his home, but her parents had just arrived. He assumed she wanted to stay close to the rescue. I didn't realize they'd be here so soon. Who? My parents. I planned on telling you they were coming. I just wanted you to know that so you didn't think it was an ambush. He shook his head. I doubt you wanted them to see us getting it on. Her face turned all shades of pink. That took talent. No, she sounded breathless and cleared her throat. About the fundraiser. I've never participated in anything like this. I don't know how to organize myself. You bring the adoption forms and animals. I'll take care of everything else. Like shade, water and a table. I mean, I don't just allow anyone to adopt my rescues. I usually do some investigating and interview their vets, let them come visit the animal a few times so we know for sure they get along. Stalk them. Ken. She play-punched his arm. They're family. He liked playing, but no one in his pack teased him except for Beth. This was nice what he and Betty were creating. He rubbed his chin. He hadn't realized how complicated finding homes for the rescued animals would be. Well, it's a good opportunity to meet the people. Get to meet them face to face. I mean, people who support an orphanage can't be all that bad. You have a point. And anyone from the pack shouldn't need that much investigation. I know everyone very well. It was his job and responsibility to vet pack issues, triage the problems, delegate the assignments and decide what needed Ryota's personal attention. Nobody wanted the alpha scrutiny, so the pack was well behaved. It will be a great time to meet some of them. She went from bright pink to pale in seconds. The girl had real skills. What? He asked, not hiding his amusement. Too much, too fast? She buried her face against his arm. You're tossing me on a roller coaster. Ride without a harness and yelling hold on as you hit go. You haven't started screaming yet. She tossed him a heated look. I was saving that for the bedroom. Every muscle in his groin contracted at the same time and it grew difficult to walk. It was like magic. She affected everything. The air he breathed seemed fresher, colors brighter, scents clearer. He craved her in his bones. And Ryota thought he could give her up? Pretend she didn't matter? He might as well start digging his grave. Easy, wolf boy. She pressed her hands to his chest. He blinked and realized he had pinned her to the side of a brick building. Eyes. She tapped his cheeks. Teeth. She clicked her fingernail against his gnawing canines. Bad wolf. He took a deep shuddering breath. Don't tease. I can't take it. Few feet. Separating them should help. Her scent still curled around him and it didn't contain a single drop of fear. I like it too much. I'll take note of that. It sounded like a promise. Betty never felt more powerful in all her life. Ken treated her like a drug that he couldn't have enough of. His eyes and teeth returned to normal. She tried to picture a future without him and almost cried out at the emptiness that filled her heart. No, she wouldn't let that happen. This confident, caring wolf was hers and no one would take him away. No one. She grabbed his hand and walked him toward the park. Let's shift. She didn't care about past attempts. Being a soulmate proved what she believed all along. She was a shifter. She deserved a pack. Most of all, she could change shape. He marched next to her, his one step requiring two of hers. She would do this. Everything would change once she proved her old pack wrong. She would be the beta's soulmate. Maybe her parents could move here and Dad would join Newport's pack. Her heart raced as they crossed the grass of Prospect Park. Dandelions spotted. The lawn and the flower garden had gone wild. but it still held a lovely big pond with ducks and lots of trees. How come you know this park? I thought you lived on the other side of the city. In the richer part, though, for someone who seemed to have money. Ken hadn't once turned up his nose at her falling apart lifestyle. I did some real estate assessments in the area. He coughed. I stopped by the park to see what it had to offer. Besides the pond and woods, not much. It has great running paths through the woods which extend beyond the city limits and could possibly connect to a national park. She raised her eyebrows. That's informative. I like the woods. I was raised in the city. Riverbend doesn't have much to offer in wilderness. They have a river. He nodded. Newport is the same, but we want to change that. He pulled her off the beaten path and deeper into the wooded area. I'm not sure it's safe to be so far from the park. There might be gangs. We're shifters. He gave her a toothy grin. We're the predators, not the prey. She squeezed his fingers tighter and drew closer to his side. Thick leaf cover filtered out the sunlight and shadows deepened. Somehow the noise of street life vanished as if behind a veil. It was magical. Ken slowed his pace, his shoulders more relaxed. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed the back of her fingers. Everything smelled green and fresh. She didn't go to parks often. If anything, she took her Great Danes to the pond to swim on hot days. Ken parted the thick foliage and gestured for her to walk ahead. She pushed past the ground cover and halted. Sunlight painted a small patch of grass in bright greens. Birdsong was the only thing she could hear. Ken's body heat pressed against her back. No one should bother us here. He crossed to the center and sat in the grass. She kicked off her shoes and squished the delicate blades with her toes. Should I take off my clothes? Sure. He followed with a huge shit-eating grin. Will it help or hinder the process? He sighed. We'll probably end up making out at some point, but I'm willing to make the sacrifice. She knelt in front of him. If I shift in my dress, it will tear apart and then I'll have to walk home naked. They really hadn't thought things through before leaving the rescue. Just take off the dress but leave your underwear on. His expression was somber. Seriously, I can control my beast urges. This is important. She pulled her sundress over her head and folded it on the ground. Okay, so now what? You remember the trigger exercises they made us practice? Do I ever? She grimaced. Most shifters could change shape by the age of 13 when hormones surged, but some shifters were late bloomers. Chris, the alpha of Riverbend, had been one. It was how they had met, taking late bloomer classes after school. Chris had finally shifted at the age of 15. Betty, of course, never had. She knew these lessons well enough to teach them to the younger students. This won't be like forcing a shift, right? She wrung her hands. Because that didn't work. Shifters said the process hurt. She had just stood there, while the old alpha had tried to link with her wolf through a pack bond. No pain, no connection, nothing. It had failed so spectacularly that she'd been declared human on the spot. I don't know. I've never tried this and I don't want to make any false promises. She gave him an uncertain nod. Honesty was a good thing, but she sure could use a little false reassurance right now. What do I do? Go through the exercises. From what I've read on the process, once you touch upon your trigger, I should sense your magic and I'll call to it. Our bond should link us together and I should be able to help you shift. Are you sure? That sounds kind of like witch stuff. She wasn't crazy about witches. They could be way out there. Even though they all claim to be white witches, black magic came from somewhere. It is. He laughed. Every shifter contains some magic. When we change shape, calls out to others of our kind. That's why we change in a pack, it's so much faster. She nodded. One of the ceremonies near my 18th birthday was trying to shift with the pack. Everyone had come to help me, but I didn't hear the call. If it didn't work with my whole pack, why do you think it will work with just you? He pressed his lips over hers. A flash of heat singed her mouth. Promise. Linked to what could be their future. Because you are everything. Betty closed her eyes and went through the exercises, from visualizing her wolf self to running through her most vivid memories, trying to discover something that would trigger her change. Fingers brushed her temples and Ken leaned in so close they shared air. Sweat coated her skin. She concentrated, all her being focused on becoming her real self. She would shift this time. She would. Her limbs trembled and she gasped for air. So close. She'd break her own bones if it would help her change to a werewolf. Ken's grip tightened until it felt like he was pushing against her brain. She moaned, her head pounding. Ken released her. I can't sense anything. Her eyes popped open. Don't say that. It sounded like defeat. She needed his encouragement because she'd already been down this terrible road. He sat slumped in the grass. I can't sense any magic. I can't call to you if there's no magic. If he gave up, then she might as well pack her bags and go home with her parents. Betty sagged, leaning on her hands. She couldn't believe she'd let him talk her into this. He'd ripped open old wounds and she sat here bleeding to death. I shouldn't have tried. The last word hiccuped in her throat before being followed by a sob. She crushed her fist in her mouth to stop the flood of more. Ken moved so swiftly she didn't see him until he caught her in his arms. Don't give up. We've just started. He gave her a shake. Don't you dare give up on us. She shook her head. I don't want to. She hated how devastated she sounded. Years of healing gone in moments. What do we do now? He kissed her forehead. I have a friend who didn't shift until her mid-20s. She studied with lots of shifters on how to change shape. We'll go see her tomorrow. She wiped the tear that trickled down her cheek. Okay. She wouldn't give up that easily. Chapter 16. The next morning found Betty sharing a pot of coffee with her mother while her dad chased the dogs in her yard in a game of pull the tail. He was a huge puppy at heart. Her mom sighed, chin in hands as she watched her massive husband fake a death faint for the happy pack of dogs. Do you think you and Ken can give me grandbabies soon? Betty's coffee went down the wrong hole and she coughed her windpipe clear. Her mother just smiled. Nice, Mom. Ken will be here soon. Can we hold off on the puppy talk? I have more pressing matters to take care of. Yes, like the soulmate ceremony. Mom clapped her hands. We'll need new dresses and we need to find out about the pack celebration venues. I wonder if they'll let us invite some of the Riverbend pack? Everyone there is so happy. For you. The bottom went out from Betty's stomach. The ceremony. Dresses? She didn't have money for food, let alone a new dress. Her parents had just filled her fridge without question. Tears threatened to well up in her eyes. She fought valiantly, blinking like a warrior. Mom reached across the table and dabbed her eyes with a paper napkin. I know. I'm so happy too. Betty forced a watery smile. Mom didn't understand a whole lot when it came to pack politics. What shifters thought of as logical she considered crazy. Betty decided not to explain the problem of her inability to shift and Ken's claim of her being his soulmate. Being born and raised human, Mom didn't have their instincts. There had been incidents such as showing up to the Alpha's house uninvited to discuss policy changes. Like he was a mayor and her a voter. Packs weren't a democracy. Her mother would probably just say, why not get married then? That would have worked if Ken hadn't publicly claimed her. His mouth had taken that option away. Hello. Ken's voice called from the waiting room. We're in here. Betty gulped the rest of her coffee. Mom sat up straighter at Ken's arrival. Betty's handsome mate looked good enough to eat in jeans that hugged him in all the right places and a short-sleeved polo shirt. He beamed his charming smile and she melted a little in her chair. What was such a professional-looking guy doing in her life? She, on the other hand, looked like she'd fallen off a Grateful Dead tour bus and had been dragged for a mile. Well, she felt like she'd been dragged. Her parents had used her bed, so she'd slept on the couch. It had more springs than cushions. Betty pulled on a thin long-sleeved sweater. Where are you two going? Mom rose and set their empty cups aside. I'm introducing Betty to my best friend. Want to come? Mom laughed. No, go have fun. He leaned on the back of an empty chair across from her mother. She's a dragon, he added. Betty's heart stopped. You never mentioned that. There were only 2 dragons. In Newport. Which one? Please not the black one, please not the black one. Angie's the white one. Well then let me get my purse. I've never met a dragon. Mom hurried to the apartment. Ken eyed Betty's sweater. It's a little warm for long sleeves. She shrugged. He was right though. She would sweat her ass off, but she wanted to keep her tattoos covered. She had learned the hard way that people jumped to conclusions before even getting to know her, so when she wanted to make a good impression she covered them. no matter how hot or itchy. She eyed Ken with his perfect boy next door looks. What would the dragon think of her? She and Ken came from such opposite backgrounds. Her family and friends weren't judgmental. They were wild and crazy, so no matter what they'd accept him as he came, business suits and all. And Ken had an alpha dad with money. And they were both professionals. These things were just words in her vocabulary, not a reality. Not until now. How would they ever fit in each other's lives? She dropped her gaze and clutched her arms around her abdomen. I'll be fine. She wore her cleanest t-shirt under the sweater and a pair of jeans. Not saying much since she worked with dogs, everything had some sort of stain. Should I change? I could wear a dress. The puzzled expression on his face almost made her laugh. What's going on? He glanced above her where they could hear her mom tearing apart her home, swearing under her breath, trying to find her purse. Did your parents say something? No, what do you mean? You're acting weird. He sniffed. You smell upset. Don't, she growled, more at herself than him. Pulling off her sweater, she showed him her tattooed arms. The artwork was gorgeous, but not everyone saw. Ink skin is beautiful. This is me. Tattoos, stained clothes, and dirt. Poor. She rubbed her elbow, suddenly feeling more naked than when her dad had walked in yesterday. Are you sure you want to introduce me to your friends? Being Beta was a political role. Being his mate meant she'd be under pack spot light. She wanted to throw up. Understanding dawned on his face. He ran his hands over her arms, tracing the designs with his fingertips. You're a little nutty, you know that? She snapped her teeth at him, hearing the tease in his voice. You'll fit in with my friends better than I do. Are you sure? She pictured business suits and coiffed hair, briefcases filled with file folders, serious conversations while they sipped expensive wines and contemplated the hint of wood in the flavor. Then she woke up from her worries as she stared into his eyes. Ken hadn't done any of the things she'd pictured. Why would he have friends that did? Do you own a briefcase? He scratched his head. I think so. Why do you want me to buy you one? She hugged him hard. Never. Ow, that's a rib cracking. He kissed the top of her head. Ready, Mom declared, purse in hand. In the yard, Dad had the Great Danes leashed. I thought I'd take them swimming. It's supposed to be a hot day. He eyed Mom. Where are you going? To meet a dragon. She kissed his cheek and patted the bulge in his shirt pocket. It yipped and Betty's teacup chihuahua's head emerged. Mom scowled. We've discussed this. No more dogs, Chuck. But it's so small. It doesn't count. He cradled it in the palms of his hands, making kissy faces at the pup. We have enough pets. Mom rolled her eyes. Dad winked at Betty. Have fun storming the castle. Don't let the dragon eat your mother. Sure thing, Daddy. She scratched him behind his ear and kissed the dogs. Ken watched silently by the door. As she passed, he whispered in her ear. You're very lucky. She squeezed his hand. The luckiest. Now if only some of it would rub off on her shifting skills. Sardined in Ken's sport car, they drove through Newport's poorest section and past the large wooded lot that housed the orphanage. She made a mental checklist of what she needed to prepare for the fundraiser. Maybe Trixie would let her use the work truck to transport the dogs and cats here. Betty added that to her to-do list. They just had crossed over the invisible line that separated her part of the city and the wealthier downtown area when they stopped in front of a salon called Scratch Your Itch. Back scratching for shifters in need. Betty read the small print. I should have brought Dad. Don't worry, honey. He gets enough of that at home. Mom crawled out of the back seat with a groan. She patted her bottom. I guess I have more junk in the trunk than I thought. For a minute I thought we'd need to call for the jaws of life. Ken held the door to the salon open for them. Inside, a pretty blonde shifter female all but bounced in excitement at the desk. Her curls were pinned in a perfect twist and she moved more gracefully on heels than Betty did in sneakers. Are you Betty? The blonde asked. She nodded and took a step toward the exit, which Ken blocked. Betty scanned for other options. Not sure she could handle a bubbly werewolf. The female grabbed both of Betty's hands and dragged her across the room with uncanny strength. I'm Beth, the Pack Omega. Beth pulled her into a spine-cracking hug. I'm so excited for your soulmate ceremony. Don't break her, Beth. Ken growled as he pried Betty out of her arms. Beth rushed to the desk, gesturing to a huge stack of binders. I have all the pack associated companies in Newport in these binders. When you're done with Angie, we can sit down and start planning the event. Everyone's so jazzed. Oh, Betty leaned against Ken. The whole pack wants to attend? Dollar signs flashed before her eyes and the room spun. Duh, soulmates don't happen every year. Beth tilted her head. Are you feeling all right? You look a little pale. She gasped. Don't tell me you're with pup already. Mom squealed next to her. No, Ken and Betty shouted at the same time. He ran his hand down his face, and Betty fanned hers. A woman with a dark pixie haircut leaned against the wall. Betty wasn't sure when she had slipped in, but the strange woman hadn't been there when she'd arrived. An amused smirk lifted her lips as their gazes met. She held out her hand. I'm Angie. The dragon, Betty whispered, still staring. Angie pointedly looked at Mom. And this is... She snapped out of her state and shook her hand. Sorry, this is my mother. Charlene. Mom curtsied. Pleased to meet you. Angie hid a smile behind her hand. Don't you have work today? She asked Ken. I took the day off. Ryota let you? Angie raised an eyebrow. He didn't have a choice. Ken set his hands on Betty's shoulders, his strength bleeding into her. Look at you being all rebellious. Angie winked at Betty. I like your influence already. Her gaze traveled to her tattooed arms. She covered her forearms with her hands. Nice skin work. My mate is covered in them. She drew closer. They all look similar in design. Vampire artist. Her eyes widened. Damper, actually. She did them at cost since she was still learning the trade. Oh, Owen's artist lives here in Newport. Maybe he's one of her teachers. Betty liked Angie already. She seemed easygoing even if smoke trickled from her left nostril. Angie rubbed her hands together. So when do we get started? I cleared the rest of the afternoon and thought we'd go to the castle for some privacy. Betty caught Beth's fallen expression that matched Mom's. Why don't you both go through those binders and make a list of your top 3 choices of everything? Betty didn't even know where to start when planning a mating ceremony. They'd be doing her a favor by narrowing down her choices. It was like a supernova of excitement went off. Mom and Beth dragged 2 chairs together and grabbed a binder each. Ken pulled out a credit card from his wallet and handed it to her mother. There's no limit on the card. She blinked and gave Betty a surprised look. It's customary for the bride's family to pay for the wedding. For humans, but in the pack, the most dominant of the couple pays. He guided Betty toward the exit. Ken. Angie shook her head. Girls only. He set his hands on his hips. But I thought we would use my call to pull her through the shift. She nodded. First, let us work on some tricks. Why don't you meet us at the castle in a couple of hours? Bring lunch. His grip tightened on Betty's shoulders before reluctantly letting go. You okay with that? Her heart flip-flopped at the idea of being alone with the dragon. Sure. Angie was his best friend, but was Betty about to be her lunch? Ken pulled her outside of the back-scratching salon for a kiss. Panty melting. Hormone raging, tear his clothes off. Let her breathe. Angie smacked him in the head. How will you get there? He rubbed his ear. Betty leaned against the building and caught her breath, admiring the way his shirt hugged his broad shoulders. We'll fly, Angie responded. Betty's squeal sounded too much like her mom's. Heat scorched her cheeks and she pressed her cool hands to them. I've never flown before. How many times have you flown with a passenger? Ken's eyebrows furrowed as he questioned Angie. I won't drop her. Scout's honor. He snorted. You were never a scout. Chapter 17. Glancing over his shoulder, Ken watched as Angie tugged Betty by the hand toward the back of the building. His mate tossed him an anxious look before disappearing in an alley that led behind Scratch Your Itch. She didn't have any reason to worry. Angie would take care of her. His heart weighed heavy. She had better take care of Betty. He had planned on spending the whole day with her. This unexpected development left a hole in his schedule, and he wasn't the type to leave the gap empty. He scratched his chin and scanned the sky. Maybe he should start moving Betty out of the rescue and into his home. With the orphanage fundraiser, they should hopefully find the animals' prospective homes, then she could make the move permanent. Voila! Eviction. Problem solved. Eardrum-piercing screams split the air. He pressed his hands over his sensitive ears and spun toward the source, crouched and ready to fight. Angie, in her white dragon form, beat her wings as she gained altitude. His soulmate clutched in one of her clawed talons, screaming like a monster movie victim. Feet rooted on the pavement, Ken drowned in horror as one of Betty's shoes hit the storefront window of the coffee shop down the street. He had thought Angie had some kind of riding harness and Betty would be on her back. He reached for his trigger memory to shift when Betty stopped screaming and waved at him. Angie dived close enough for him to see a self-satisfied grin on Betty's face. Aimed in his direction. Trigger memory vanished. He rubbed his head as the dragon carted her off to the castle. Betty had just scared 10 years off his life and she found it amusing. Was this what their relationship would be like? They needed to have talk. Teasing him was one thing, this crossed a line. A hand landed on his shoulder and Ken jumped high enough to slam into the streetlight above. Shattered glass rained down on him. Joshua, one of his packmates, stared at him with wide eyes. You're looking pale. He brushed off pieces of the light from Ken's shoulders. Ken took a deep breath and reined in his nerves. Joshua was high in the pack's hierarchy. Showing weakness in front of the other hunter wasn't acceptable and would give Joshua bad ideas. He couldn't beat Ken in a challenge, but Joshua believed differently. Ken didn't want to put him in a hospital again. Those bills were high and the pack had better things to spend their money on than a hunter's ego. Was that your mate the dragon just stole? Joshua asked. Other hunters from the pack were with him. They wore shorts and sweat-stained t-shirts and smelled like his locker in high school. One of them was carrying a basketball. No, yes. Ken shook his head. Yes, that was my mate, but the dragon didn't steal her. You know better than that, Josh. Angie and Betty are friends. Stretching the truth was as close as a lie a shifter could try without being detected. He hoped Angie and Betty would be friends. After that stunt he'd say they were a match made in heaven. The moon help him if he was ever home alone with those two troublemakers. He grinned. Betty is something else. Rumor is she can't shift. Benoit moved in closer. He was a good wolf and a better friend. Benoit probably didn't realize the corner he'd backed Ken into. And so it begins. The fight to keep his mate. He'd hoped for a few more weeks. But that had been a fool's dream. At hearing this piece of gossip, Joshua's face split into a shit-eating grin. Benoit glimpsed Joshua's expression and he grimaced. I have cousins in the Riverbend pack. They are in an uproar since she was banned a few years ago as human. Their old alpha was challenged over the decision and lost to the new alpha. There's lots of bad blood over it. Ken gave Benoit a slow blink, amazed at how fast wolves gossiped. I heard about that challenge. Betty had told him about her ex-boyfriend and how he had become alpha of Riverbend pack, but it didn't lessen the shock that his pack knew as well. No matter what he did, he couldn't prepare Betty for how the packs would delve into every nook and cranny of her past. He'd been groomed for a position of power within the pack since the day Ryota had adopted him, so he'd kept his nose clean. Betty hadn't had that foresight. How could she when her old pack had brainwashed her into thinking she was human? Why would they fight over her? Joshua cried out. I need to hear this now. Benoit's shoulders slumped and he instinctively gravitated toward Ken for protection. Ken rested his hand on Benoit's shoulder. I want to hear it too. He met Joshua's stare until he dropped it. I have no secrets. Let's grab some coffee and get off the sidewalk. Letting this opportunity to hear the rumors firsthand go by would be a mistake. Transparency had been Ryota's biggest asset when he'd taken over New Port's werewolf pack. No secrets. No lies. The pack respected their alpha and Ken agreed with his father's policy, even when the truth sucked. He herded the small group of males farther down the street to his favorite coffee shop. The barista made the best siphon coffee in the city. It could jumpstart a dead car battery. Drinks ordered and paid for by Ken. He joined the others in the couch area, with Benoit the center of attention. So the challenge? Ken leaned back in his chair, legs crossed, taking over the conversation before Joshua could. Inside, Ken wanted to shake the information from the shifter across from him, but after years of being beaten, he learned how to keep even his scent calm. The present alpha was her boyfriend. When she left the city and him, he blamed the old leader. He demanded her return and challenged him. Benoit accepted his cup from the server and took a sip of his steaming coffee. He destroyed him is what I heard. I mean, like shredded him like pulled pork. Joshua whistled. The higher the position in the pack, the deadlier the fighter. It was why Ken had to put Joshua in the hospital last year. If he took it easy on Joshua, then more attempts to usurp Ken would occur. Ken had made Joshua an example. So, he understood why the young wolf made such a show of killing Riverbend, Pack's old leader. So why didn't she go back when he took over the pack? Why did she stay in Newport? Asked Remy, a shifter who had just won his first hierarchy fight last week, which explained why he was hanging out with the top hunters today. Ken wanted to say because she never loved her ex-boyfriend and was waiting for Ken to find her. But even he knew that reeked of bullshit. Pack law supersedes alpha laws, Ken whispered. No humans are pack. The hardest thing he'd ever voiced. So? She could be honorary pack like all the other human spouses. Joshua accepted his coffee from the barista. Could you accept being honorary pack after living as a shifter your whole life? Ken sipped his drink, temperature close to lava. The barista was human and didn't understand he should have been served first. Such laws had to be bent outside their kind. Ken hid his satisfaction as Joshua swore after burning his tongue. No one responded to Ken's question. They didn't have to. It was obvious. None of them could live as humans, so how could they expect different from Betty? Ken smiled into his cup, happy his point was made. What are you going to do? Benoit asked. I mean, if she can't shift, the pack won't accept her. Ken set his cup down and met each hunter's gaze until their eyes dropped. She's shifter enough to have me as her soulmate. Only shifters can have soulmates. Joshua had to add, even though he still stared at his shoes. Predictable as always. Exactly, Ken purred. She's a shifter. She will change shape. She just needs the right incentive. Slowly, they finally raised their eyes and met his wolfish grin. Angie set Betty on the ground gently, then the dragon landed next to the castle. Did you see the look on Ken's face? You have a great set of lungs, by the way. That scream was killer. A laugh died on the tip of Betty's tongue as she recalled the horror on Ken's face. Maybe she had gone too far. And kicking off your shoe was genius. It took the whole prank to the next level. Angie looked Betty over. I think this is the start of beautiful relationship. She shifted and ran into the castle, but naked. Give me a second, she called out. It had seemed like fun when Angie suggested the joke. Now Betty's stomach churned with butterflies. Once she'd seen the determined expression on his face, like he was going to shift and attack his best friend, Betty had changed her mind and stopped screaming. He'd visibly relaxed when he saw her smile. She wouldn't scare him like that again. That was a dumbass move. He cared for her and she'd used it against him. Ready? A dressed Angie waved to enter her home. Betty had been so lost in her thoughts that she hadn't admired the massive stone building until now. Wow. She leaned her head back to see the top of the towers. All you're missing is a moat and knights in armor. She'd seen photos of Newport Castle on television, but Owen, the Black Dragon, never let the press on his land for close-up pictures. This was a privilege few people experienced. Is your mate here? She asked. Angie seemed real nice, but Betty hadn't heard many good stories about Owen. He's out picking trash for his sculptures. Sculptures? Angie pointed out a sharp angular metal object protruding from the ground. Owen is an artist. Betty had mistaken it for a weapon. She kept that to herself though. That's very intense. Scary was more like it. He makes these out of trash? Old cars mostly. She stared hard at the statue. Nope, she couldn't see a car in there no matter what angle she titled her head. Owen melts them down before sculpting. Angie wiggled her hands. We don't burn easily. He uses molten metal like clay? Okay, Betty had to admit that was fucking cool. I can see the appeal. She followed Angie inside the castle and slowed her steps once over the threshold. The entrance was empty but impressive in size. Even the inside walls were built of ancient stone. A scatter of dead leaves and spider webs were the only decorations. I assume you went through all of the basic shifting classes. Angie crossed the room quickly and took a hall to the right. Betty hurried after her, not wanting to get lost. Until I could recite the lessons backwards. Her eyes scanned the threadbare tapestry hanging on the hallway walls. Dragons, fire and fighting. Why weren't there pictures of dragons sniffing flowers? She paused by the largest tapestry that reached ceiling to floor done in flamboyant reds and oranges. A whole flight of dragons burning a village. Angie returned to her side. Badass, huh? Not the word Betty would have used. Terrifying, chilling, disturbing were few words that came to mind though. Hey, wait a minute. She scanned the other tapestries again. Why doesn't anyone else have feathers? Angie shrugged. We haven't really figured it out why I have them. My egg was stolen from its nest, so I don't know what clan I'm from. Betty raised an eyebrow. No, there's not an obvious feathered dragon clan, but Owen says there are some reclusive clans that I might be from. They stay away from other species and live high in the mountains. Angie turned away from the pictures. Come on. Betty wanted to ask Angie why she wasn't tearing the mountains apart to find her clan. Pack was the heart of being a werewolf. Betty knew firsthand how crappy it felt to be an outcast, to be alone. But Angie was a dragon. Maybe they didn't depend on each other like a pack. The bone deep need to hang out together, lean on each other and have fun. The last couple of days with Ken had reminded her of how much she missed being around her own kind. Trixie and Betty's other human friends were great support. But the bond was different. Ken said, you recently learned to shift. Betty walked faster so they were side by side in the wide hall. I was like you, told I was human because I couldn't shift even though I rang a shifter on their radars. I never felt human and assumed I was some genetic throwback from a distant shifter relative that made me weird. They climbed a stairwell that went both below and above them. How big was this place and how many floors? Owen insisted I was dragon from the moment we met. She shook her head. I thought he was a crazy, but I wasn't going to argue with a dragon. Finally, after climbing half the tower, Angie led her into a long hall dotted with closed doors. At the end they entered a crowded sitting room filled with couches and chairs placed closely to a fireplace. This is what I call our living room. A lot of the castle has fallen to disrepair over the decades, and this is one of the few intact rooms. She pointed at the glass windows set in the stone walls. It's where we spend most of our time as humans. She flopped onto a couch. Betty sat across from her. So how did you shift? The suspense was killing her. Did she have the solution to Betty's problem? After years of trying to figure out what I was, Owen discovered I had a spell blocking my magic. That's why I never shifted. I wish I could get refunded all the money I spent on shifting lessons. Angie sighed and hugged a decorative pillow to her stomach. I used every dime I had to find my place in the world. At least until I opened Scratch Your Itch. That's where I belong. Not some obscure clan. A spell. Betty leaned forward, elbows resting on her knees. Magic users existed, but like vampires they live very secretive lives. She'd heard of places where a person could purchase love spells or charms, but more times than not they didn't work. Her mother had warned her that real magic came with price. She didn't mean the kind that had dollar signs either. Magic wanted precious things like life. Why the fuck would someone put a spell on you to stop you from shifting? Pardon my French. Angie snorted. I spent a lot of time growing up on the streets. Swearing is just punctuation as far as I'm concerned. Her smile turned sad. It's a long story. Let's just say they did it out of love, not malice. So I can't be angry. Well, not much. I don't think anyone's used magic on me. My parents and old Pack turned themselves inside out trying to help me shift. Someone would have a sensed spell, and I don't have enemies who hate me enough to curse me or anything. But maybe there was a spell she could buy that would help her trigger the shift instead of preventing her. Like the opposite of what Angie had. She wasn't crazy about using magic, but she was desperate enough to at least consider it. List all the things you've tried so I don't waste our time replicating things. That didn't work. Betty went over the endless exercises and their variations. Meditating with monks. Never heard of that one. Angie chewed her bottom lip, looking lost in thought. It was the longest week of my life. The monastery had been quiet and boring. But boy could those monks cook. They made the simplest of meals taste heavenly. Angie set the decorative pillow aside and leaned forward. How far are you willing to go? Betty's heart thundered. That was the million-dollar question. She focused inward. If she didn't learn how to change shape, the packs would either chase her away from Ken or kill her. She wasn't stupid. Pack law was so firm she could bounce a quarter off it. Soulmates were always shifters, and here was Ken, beta of a powerful pack, publicly claiming her after her pack declared her human. If the packs let this slide, other half-breeds would demand similar treatment. A line had been drawn long ago as to who was considered shifter, and Ken had shoved her over it. They would probably let her live if she denied his claim. If she left him, a future without Ken was unthinkable, though. She'd never accept another man in her life. Not after meeting her soulmate. She'd grow old all by herself. Death. That's how far I'd go. Until I die. Chapter 18. Angie gave Betty a slow blink. Hey there, psycho. Good thing I'm not willing to go that far. She grabbed her hand and squeezed it. Ken won't let you go. You know that, right? He spent the last 3 years hunting for you. Betty raised her eyebrows. Finding her soulmate hadn't been on her to-do list. Especially when she had to leave her home and start fresh in Newport. Finding her next meal had seemed more important. With a snort, Angie shook her head. Once he figured out none of the females in the Newport pack matched, he went to every multi-pack shifter event he found. Here you were right under his nose the whole time, thinking you were human. It's a miracle we met. She swallowed with a throat gone dry. How many shifters never found their special someone? The stars and planets had to align in just the right way for soulmates' paths to cross. What if Ken hadn't taken his dogs for a midnight run? Who the hell runs at midnight? What if Trixie hadn't been trigger happy? The whole thing smelled like fate. Angie thought death too high a price to pay for the ability to shift into a werewolf, but Betty had found the perfect mate. She planned on keeping him. Every moment together, every touch, just proved how much she wanted him. No pack would ever accept him if she couldn't shift, and she never wanted him to suffer as a lone wolf. She rose to her feet, pulling Angie up onto hers. Where do we begin? None of the fluffy feel-good triggers have worked for you. Angie cracked her fingers. There's an extreme thing we can try that packs won't do. Oh. Betty pressed her hand to her chest, trying to steady the beat. Why? Too many deaths. Angie's stare pinned hers. You have to swear not to tell Ken or Owen. They'll both get pissed. Is that why you asked to be alone? She could do this, no matter how scary Angie was making it sound. Betty came from a long line of werewolves. Courage ran in her veins. Smart girl. Let's do this. Betty wrung her trembling hands. What was so extreme that shifters banned it? They tended to be a tough species, kind of hard to kill. Angie took a deep breath and then slapped Betty across the face. Her vision blurred as it went from staring at Angie to looking at the fireplace. Her body had twisted with the force. The sting spread to her gums. She tongued her teeth, checking if any were missing. Motherfucker, what was that for? The fight or flight response can trigger a shift. Angie bounced on her feet, shaking out her hands as if preparing to box. I've been struck before, Angie. This is what shifters ban. They hit each other all the time. Angie slapped her other cheek. This time Betty tasted blood. Wait. She held up her hands to block another strike. I was told the trigger responds once the shifter-to-be is at death's door. Angie shoved Betty's hands aside and punched her in the nose. She stumbled backwards, tripping over the couch and landing on her butt. Clapping her hands over her face, Betty bit back her tears. Would Angie's Owen eat her if she kicked Angie's ass? It was worth the risk. The dragon rubbed her hands. Shifters don't strike children and females. She strode toward her. For Ken, I don't have a problem beating the shit out of you if you shift. Betty Crab walked away. What if she didn't shift? She had said she was willing to die. That had sounded like a sound idea a few seconds ago, but the blood trickling from her nose was changing her mind. Angie still marched forward as Betty's back hit the wall. Her foot landed close to Betty's and she kicked out, sweeping Angie's feet from under her. The dragon sprawled to the side, knocking a bureau onto its side. Something squeaked and scurried across Angie's legs. She screamed. Betty's ears rang from the dragon-sized noise and she sat up in time to see a family of rats rush under the furniture. Like a circus performer, Betty leaped onto a coffee table across the room. Angie kicked the stone wall with her dragon might and a flood of rodents flowed out. Her eyes widened so much Betty could see her soul. With a soundless look of horror, Angie changed to her dragon form in a flutter of torn clothes and dragon feathers. It wasn't one of those smooth, fluid changes she'd seen many practiced shifters execute. Angie's skin flashed to scales and feathers so she looked like a mutant dinosaur angel. Then her teeth and claws grew before the rest of her body shifted. Betty's jaw dropped open and she flinched at the residual pain from being struck. Where was her camera phone when she needed it? No one would believe her. Angie's silent scream turned into a roar until flames poured from her snout. The bureau and the lamp turned to ash. Betty dropped her hand over her swollen lips, ignoring the sharp pain. She'd been standing there a few seconds ago. The dragon jumped onto the couch in full huge beast form and it shattered to kindling. Little wooden projectiles struck Betty. She'd be picking splinters out of her flesh for the next month. Sentience was nowhere to be seen in Angie's eyes as they daggered in the rat's direction. Angie's tail whipped Betty off her feet. She fell in what seemed like slow motion where she could see her feet in the air before landing on her back. Not fun. The air was knocked out of Betty's lungs and she fought to breathe until they remembered how they worked. She rolled over, landing on her hands and knees. The coffee table had miraculously survived the impact. Betty crawled for the exit as fast as she could while Angie lost her shit. Once out of the room, she pressed her back to the stone wall. Not a rat to be seen. They had the right idea. Until Angie pulled herself together, Betty would hide. Barbecued was not the look she wanted to wear to her soulmating ceremony. Angie backed into the window. Shattered glass tinkled down the exterior of the stone castle. This sent her into another spitfire roar. Seriously, how did she not singe her own feathers? Betty ran down the hall and took the stairs. She couldn't recall how many flights they had climbed, but she kept descending. At the bottom she continued running, glancing over her shoulder for any sign of pursuit. A thick wooden, iron-studded door broke her stride. She stumbled back, the shockwave making her bones ache. She groaned. The silver lining? She'd been looking over her shoulder so her throbbing nose escaped being squished again. She took note of the low ceiling and dank smell. She must be in the basement instead of the ground floor. "Hello?" asked a thickly accented voice on the other side of the door. Metal scraped on stone. "Who is that?" Her traitorous feet rooted to the floor. Owen. She'd never heard him speak. Was he Russian? No, the noise stopped. "My name is Victor. Come in where I can see you." "Little thief." His voice caressed her like silk. "I have been so lonely." She cracked the door open. A bare-chested man stood in the center of the stone room. His hands were behind his back. Skin so pale, he appeared painted in the moonlight. Black hair flowed over his shoulders so straight and shiny it gave the illusion of liquid. "Hi," she whispered. "I'm not a thief. I'm Angie's friend." "I can barely hear you." "Come closer." "Do you have a name, Angie's friend?" All her danger signals went off, but her feet moved forward. As she approached, she noted handwritten names tattooed all over his torso like lists. "Betty Newman. A pleasure to meet you." He took her hand and raised it to his full bloodless lips. The kiss lingered on her skin just long enough to make her uncomfortable. His gaze traveled over her tattoos and he jerked her against him. "Who is your artist?" He twisted her left arm and examined the details of one of the designs. With a fingertip, he traced the symbols that flowed one into the other around her biceps. "This is wrong. She's in Riverbend." Betty noticed the thick manacles around his wrists. Two separate massive chains linked them to the stone wall. What kind of kink were the dragons into? "Are you my meal? A test to see if I'm sane yet." He pulled her closer, his strength unnatural. She tried to yank free. No, then she spotted the tip of his fangs pressed to his bottom lip. A chained vampire in a dragon's basement. What the fuck? "You need to let me go. Angie is expecting me. She'll be angry if you hurt me." He gripped her upper arms. "You're bleeding." He licked the corner of her mouth. "So much for not dying." Out of the dragon's fire and into the vampire's clutches. "I'm not fond of shifters." He grimaced. "You have a gamey taste." "I'm not food. I came down here by accident." Had he just said she tasted like shifter? "There are no accidents, Betty." The vampire wrapped her in a constricting hug. "I have impulse control issues and I need a snack. Just a little more." Owen slammed the brakes of Ken's sports car and screeched it into park by his castle. Ken's chest strained against his seatbelt before he snapped back. The dragon ran his hands possessively over his steering wheel. Thanks for letting me drive her. I've been thinking about purchasing one. Ken had offered Owen a ride home when he'd spotted him exiting the local art studio across the street from the coffee shop. Somehow the dragon had managed to talk him into taking over the steering wheel of Ken's baby. She's not for sale. Everything is for sale. It's just finding the right price. No, Ken undid his restraint and climbed out of the car. Halting, he rubbed his eyes to clear his vision. Nope, he saw correctly. Why is your mate's ass hanging out of the window? He wasn't supposed to come here while Angie trained Betty, but she could bite him. He wanted to spend time with Betty. Owen climbed out of the car, stroking his hand absent-mindedly over the hood, while staring up at the white dragon's tail. I'm not sure, but it's a fine view. Don't you think you should change and help her? Yes, but is she trying to get in the castle or out? Owen had a point. Then Angie roared. Flames reflected on the intact windows. Ken's heart stopped. Betty was in there. He shoved Owen out of his way and kicked their front door open. He hadn't been here before but followed Betty's scent to a set of stairs. He paused, the smells confusing. She had crossed the area twice and the freshest scent went to the basement. Betty hadn't been in the room with the blast of fire, but he smelled blood. Was faint, but his mate was hurt. He stormed down, taking the stairs two at a time. At the bottom he found an open wooden door. Hushed voices carried from the room. Inside, he found Betty in the arms of another man as he licked her